seated with Dr. Eric Goldman, distinguished professor of history for many years, more than 20 years at Princeton University, a Rollins professor, and as you probably know, was also a special consultant for President Johnson for three, how shall we describe it, highly traumatic years and fascinating years for Professor Goldman.
Not without their comic relief, though.
Not without comic relief. And perhaps we can touch upon all aspects of it. There's a book just published by Alfred Knopf, and it's The Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson by Eric E. Goldman. And you said not without comic relief. Now, naturally, this will lead up to the Festival of the Arts, but before that, the idea of a scholar during a climate that was not too scholarly at the White House.
Yeah, there was something a little rococo about it all. Looking back on it, it seems more amusing, of course, than it did at the time. But it even starts in an unusual way. After all, I'd never met Mr. Johnson, and as I tell in the book, this young student of mine at Princeton had gone down there to work for the vice president. And he had said some generous words about me to Vice President Johnson, and Vice President Johnson said he wanted to meet me and talk to me. Well, by the time I went down there, Vice President Johnson was President Johnson. And it begins in that way. I think what really gives it its humor is the fact that there was something fundamentally clashing, I suppose, between the kind of thing I was trying to do and Mr. Johnson's own interests and instincts.
Now, he probed you when you first met him, and he said something about he wanted you to gather, there's a phrase he used a lot, the best minds.
The best minds. He wasn't the only person who used it. I noticed Mr. Nixon used it the other day, too.
The best minds.
The best minds, yes.
The best minds cleared by the FBI, though.
In Johnson's case, yeah.
That was a fascinating point, though. We'll come to that, though. And so the position you found yourself as a student of history and a professor of history was then you wrote to a number of people, including Barbara Tuchman, others, and they offered suggestions what they thought would be a good approach.
Well,
great need for the country.
There were several different kinds of things going on. Basically, what I did was to try to get people who were very expert in specific fields, like the poverty program and so forth, grouped. And it's not the way to do things. The way the president wanted it done wasn't the way. We finally managed to straighten it out and set up the task forces, which made more sense, really.
He made it quite clear at the beginning that there was obviously he had a predecessor who was, how shall I say, more graceful in approach than he was, and there was a slight touch. He spoke of these smart Alecks from Georgetown. That was on his mind, obviously. So there was something he had to prove, too.
The president, he felt, well, as you know from the book, I think Mr. Johnson's great problem as an individual was a whole set of insecurities. And you touched on one of them. He was a man who felt that the Kennedy image, the Kennedy legacy, or the Kennedy legend, whatever you want to call it, had put him in a very difficult position. And like some human beings, he would react to it in extremes. At one moment, he was trying to imitate it without appearing to. At another moment, he would revolt completely against it and play the village clown just to show his attitude.
That he wasn't impressed overly, that he could be the rube figure, you see, who would not be taken by Eastern intellectuals. Therefore, he'd play, since he was in the nature of a wheeler and dealer from the very beginning, Here he is in the highest position, and somehow he had to. But your job, then, was involved a number of things as consultant, didn't it?
Yes, at the beginning, the president asked me to get those people together, but when I went there about 10 days after the assassination, and there really was so many things to do around which had nothing to do really with the best minds, and one jumps in and does them, and before long I was doing all kinds of things. But basically, he thought of me as a link with the intellectual world and as a kind of cultural, intellectual advisor, I suppose.
I say, even though to you, and of course you write about this quite graphically, you remember, obviously you can't forget some of these events in which you were immediately concerned. You were between a sort of a scylla of rough-hewn wheeler-dealer qualities that many surround themselves with, at the same time somewhat Eastern established, by their standards, and that was the Charybdis, and there you were in between. And so you had a balancing act. For example, when he called on there was suggestion that the distinguished sculptor Jacques Lipchitz do a medallion. Now that's a great one-act play, great comic
Yes,
play.
yes. Lipschitz, as we all know, is a man of the Cubist abstractionist tradition and a very great sculptor. And he did this profile of the president in a Lipschitz manner, which was not representational. It was not Norman Rockwell, and the president could be said to have something of a double chin in it and large ears. He brought out certain characteristics of the president he wanted to bring out. And I try to tell there, it takes a couple of pages, and we could...
But it's a marvelous scene. It may be worth reading or recounting, partly reading and recounting. When Lipschitz, a little old man, came in, being an artist, he was not a fashion.
Lipschitz came into the White House, a gray little man in a disheveled suit, a beret atop an unshaved face, socks drooping over his ankles, carrying by a piece of thick string an orange crate, which held his preliminary forms. Nelson, that's one of the men who was working with me, and I looked at each other. Lyndon Johnson was not well disposed toward people who neglected trim appearances. We ordered coffee, went to work on the Oval Office, that is the president's office, and got nowhere. Lipschitz kept saying how wonderful it was that he, a simple Jewish artist, had been invited to the White House, and we were embarrassed both by his remarks and by our inability to arrange some time. Well, we finally get him in, and I go on here, and he doesn't get much time out of the president.
He needed a certain amount of time for his model.
Yeah,
in this case.
Yeah, he
Johnson.
said he told me he needed absolute minimum. Here it is of 8 hours. And I knew that was crazy from the point of view of Johnson, who wasn't going to give any artist 8 hours. I informed the president of the need for time, and I cut it down to a diplomatic, about a total of 3 hours, while you are doing other things. The president said, 3 hours? Tell him he can look at me for 3 minutes.
And then finally, his work was seen.
Yeah, he has the rough forms finally, and takes them over to Abe Fortas's, who was a friend of Lipschitz, that's Justice Fortas, and an admirer of his work. And Nelson went over there. I was out of town to pick up these rough forms and take them over and get the president's okay. Fortas presented Nelson with the mock-up, the forms, a bottle of champagne Dom Rugnard. It was Nelson's birthday. A declaration that the Lipschitz design was great art and an encouraging pat on the shoulder. And off Nelson goes to the White House with these forms. Nelson had a date along with him, which I thought might help things a bit, because the president was always more genial when there were pretty girls around. But anyhow, Nelson and his date set the two forms up on the desk in the diplomatic reception room of the White House, through which the president and Mrs. Johnson would enter. When LBJ arrived, he asked pleasantly, "What are you two doing over here at this hour on a Sunday?" Edging the president and the first lady toward the desk, Nelson said, "Oh, we just dropped by to show you something, the final Lipschitz models." Lyndon Johnson looked down and his eye fell on the Prometheus, one side of the medallion. The president said, "Is that me?" Nelson rushed in with an attempt at diversionary humor. "That's Barry Goldwater rising out of Phoenix. This one, sir, is you," the other side of the medallion, showing the president's face. Lyndon Johnson stared at the profile, stepped aside, and stared at it again. "Looks like I've been dead 3 weeks, and maybe ought to be." He turned to Mrs. Johnson. "What do you think of it, Bird?" "Lipschitz is a great artist, Lyndon." The president poked his head closer. "Still looks like I've been dead for 3 weeks. How many people going to see this thing?" he asked Nelson. "We're only giving out 121 of them." Lyndon Johnson paused, took one more look at the profile. "Well," he said, "as long as there are only 121 of them."
And so, in a sense, you might say this comic scene really sets the climate, too, in which you were operating to find the best minds and improve the quality, or investigate the quality of American life. This basically is in a sense, might be almost a background scene.
I don't want to imply, and this book certainly doesn't, there's no sense of my looking down on the president about this. What it is that this man came from a background where those things were not considered of importance, and the attempts to do them became ludicrous. It has nothing to do with his own. He was a highly intelligent man. He was good at a different kind of thing.
But we come to something involving, though, and your book is quite revealing in that. You yourself, by the way, showed a great deal of your own obstinacy and courage. We'll come to that in a moment, as well as the dilemma in which you found yourself with the Festival of the Arts, which the audience I know is very well acquainted, beginning with the letter of rejection by poet Robert Lowell. But before that, you point out that when Johnson was vice president, he was not too quite aware of various cultures when he visited Asia, for example. Aside from his calling Ziem the Churchill of Asia, which was interesting, but his unawareness, even he was told of Thai people and customs and the non-shaking of hands. He was the great handshaker.
Yeah. He simply had not had much experience with cultures, not only outside the United States, but outside of a very limited group in Congress. He was enclosed by Congress, and he was a wonderful expert on congressional districts, interestingly enough, for the South and the West, but the big cities of the North, for example. He was a man of limited background, and then, of course, the rest of the world had not particularly interested him, as you say. He was a man of penetrating intelligence who could have read up on the Thais and found out about this, but that sort of thing didn't appeal to him.
You used a phrase, by the way, interesting throughout, Metro-American,
Yeah.
That he didn't quite dig. It didn't quite dig him. Would you mind expounding on this a bit, expanding on
Well, I noticed after I finished this book, and as the president was about to leave the White House, a reporter asked him, what about all this student discontent in the United States? And the president said, I just don't understand young people nowadays. I just don't understand them. This is a fine country, and yet they seem to be so critical of it. The remark struck me because the president, who understood so many things, was absolutely blind on the subject of what you called the Metro-American, this phrase I made up to try to describe the new type of American who has appeared in the cities and suburbs, the educated, reasonably affluent, youthful compared to the general population. I'm not talking about college kids. I'm talking about people in their 30s and 40s. I'm not talking about professional intellectuals. It may be a junior executive at Xerox and his wife who went to college at the University of Chicago or something or another. Well, now, this type of person has a set of values, some bad, some good, which are incomprehensible to the president, and they have a critical attitude toward the quality of American civilization, which, as he said, he didn't understand. And it struck me, when I first went down there, I was fascinated with the way that he used to walk out and the president would give these talks in the Rose Garden to various groups. And although the general public would never realize it because he was a bad speaker when he read from a text, but when he talked to these groups informally, he was very good and very effective with every group except this particular type I'm talking about. And there he fell flat on his face every time.
So we have this particular situation, and now this is more or less a background. There's a comical aspect at the same time. The serious now is throughout when the foreign policy, after being president and beating Goldwater on a relatively peace platform, escalation, and beginning perhaps with the Dominican affair itself. And when he sent Tom Mann down there on the hard line. And that was one of the, at the same time, escalation was happening in Vietnam. But there were remarkable comments he was making, getting about heads being cut off, and every journalist said, of course, there wasn't. They're talking about Dominica now, justifying America.
He made these wild statements that just weren't true, and they came from two things. One is that the president is a pure Texan, and I discovered that it's part of Texas culture that you tell the wild tale, and Texans discount them when they talk to each other. For example, I was taken aback to hear the president say that his forefathers had fought at the Alamo, because I happen to know that his forefathers didn't fight at the Alamo. But that didn't bother some of my Texas colleagues who understood that that's the way you talk down there. So he was given to this kind of bombastic talk. The other and more serious aspect of it is that the president had a theory about foreign policy in the presidency, which is very interesting and very important, and in my opinion, very dangerous. And that is that in foreign policy, a president does his best. He studies the situation, he asks advice, he thinks about it hard, he cares about his country, all of which was true, heavens knows, deeply true of Lyndon Johnson. And then he comes to a decision. And once he comes to a decision, it is the duty, really, of the country to follow him in foreign policy. You only have one president. He's made up his mind.
Phrase used quite often.
A phrase,
I'm the only president you have.
Yeah. And therefore, when there's dissent and criticism, to quiet it, there's almost a tendency on his part of anything goes. That is, you make up the stories, you try to influence public opinion, you denounce your dissenters with unbridled violence. It's something the president felt deeply, and of course the dangers of it are obvious.
Yeah, because this is a double study to me and fascinating. When the book, by the way, I'm talking to Eric Goldman, Professor Eric Goldman, for so many years at Princeton, and suddenly there he is for 3 years at the White House in this climate. It's a double study, one of a certain man who happened to be President Lyndon Johnson at a certain time in history, and the other Eric Goldman himself. Did you have, now you, I suppose, were torn continuously with feelings of ambivalence here.
That's right. I was. I went there, and I did, and I do believe that it is a privilege for any American to work for the President of the United States and to help in any way he can. Beyond that, I was tremendously excited by this man in the early days. He was carrying off a transition after the assassination, which was brilliantly executed. I think most students of government, I think all of them would agree, it's the most skillful transition under difficult circumstances in the United States. He then launched this great drive for the legislation of 1965, in which he passed the kind of bills which many of us had longed for 20 years. And he passed them in a kind of a drum fire of action. Ones that, for example, like changing the immigration quotas, which had long been considered impossible, he got through in 2 or 3 days. It was very exciting at first, and I felt privileged to be part of it. And but then there were these two things developing. One was certain characteristics of the man himself, which affected what he did in domestic as well as foreign affairs, and then the foreign affairs problems, the Dominican Republic and Vietnam.
And so we come to the idea that you had. In the meantime, the escalation has begun, and there are feelings in many quarters of horror at the escalation, at what some felt was, in a sense, a double-cross betrayal. And we come to the event that you conceived, the Festival of the Arts.
Yes,
this is a key, obviously it's a key chapter in your book, and I would suspect in your life.
It's curious, it's ironical, because neither I nor the President nor anyone else around there thought of this as a very important event at the beginning. We thought that it was the sort of thing a President of the United States should do. He should pay honor and encourage the people around the country who were engaged in the cultural renaissance that's going on in the United States today. And then, of course, the issue of the war got in. When Mr. Robert Lowell, who was to read from his poetry at the White House, accepted the invitation and then declined it because he said he had thought it over and he felt that by coming he would be giving a subtle commitment to support of the President's Vietnam policy. And he considered that so reprehensible, he felt he must withdraw. This let loose all kinds of things, and let loose, on the one hand, one group among the intellectuals. You notice I stress just one group who not only took a position about it, but did it with a kind of sneering contempt for the President personally, which naturally rankled him furiously. On the President's part, it brought out the worst side of his inability to take criticism of any kind. And you got these two groups locked in a uproariously funny kind of combat in a sense, but also kind of grim, because one side was know-it-all one way and the other side was know-it-all the other way. And it had a very serious effect, because the President, after that, began to assume that there wasn't any difference between this kind of intellectual and that kind of intellectual. They were all alike. They were those people, as he said, and the seriousness of that is that he began to associate anything that amounted to criticism of his Vietnamese policy with these people, those people that he didn't like, and therefore their criticism was to be ignored. Up to that time, it was possible to get the president to consider the criticisms. He didn't agree with them, but he considered them. He ran his mind over them. His mind locked at that point, unfortunately for him and unfortunately for all of us.
Yet don't you think, a moment ago you mentioned, you spoke of the certain group of intellect, don't you think that a man like Robert Lowell, the letter is quite a terribly moving letter. That
Lowell was not among the group who sneered at the president.
But nonetheless, his letter, it seemed to me, and I'm sure you would agree, was almost a metaphor for the feeling of a great many, that they could not possibly take part in a festival at the White House, in a sense, by being present, honoring, even though the office is that of the presidency, a man who was responsible and committing them to a highly irresponsible and immoral act in Asia.
I agree with you. And Lowell conducted himself with great dignity and decorum throughout it, as did many people. What I was referring to was the kind of person who accepted an invitation there and then came and drew up petitions denouncing the president in his home,
Of course, you're talking about Dwight MacDonald, and it's a very, I must admit, here again we come to the comic aspect. Yeah. Not to you. You had to obviously get a drink somewhere, but it was Dwight MacDonald going around with it, and a serious discussion with Charlton Heston. I think in itself was a very funny scene, as I envision it, you see. Mm-hmm. I think somehow to retain our sanity, we also have to have humor, too, at times such as this, you know. But nonetheless, at the beginning, did you have a feeling when Edmund Wilson brusquely rejected the thing? You had a hunch then there'd be difficulties, didn't you?
No, actually I didn't, because I thought that was part of Edmund Wilson's general, somewhat, shall we say, asocial conduct.
He thinks it's highly social conduct.
Yeah. No, and I don't think Wilson rejected it, actually, on the Vietnamese issue. That wasn't my impression. He just was brusque. No, I didn't get it until the letter arrived from Lowell. I didn't get the intimation, actually.
And then everything happened. It made the Lowell letter, of course, started, because then it was front page, of course, New York Times, and then everything happened.
Everything happened.
And then perhaps we have to reenact the scene again that was not funny to you, but funny to the readers of this. A very fascinating book, if I could just once more mention that it's just published, The Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson by Eric F. Goldman, my guest for 3 years, the consultant to the White House. The subtitle, I say, could be The Dilemma of an American Scholar at the White House. Yeah. Alfred Knopf for the publishers. But there came a very strong woman, the Mrs. President, the President's wife, I should say, Lady Bird.
A very remarkable woman, yeah.
And when John Hersey decided to come, but to read not from a novel, but from Hiroshima.
That's right. And I had invited 4 or 5 American writers to come and read from their works, people like Saul Bellow. That's how Robert Lowell was invited as a poet. And Hersey was troubled as to whether he should come or not, and decided he did want to come, that he was going to separate his own opinions from this, which was a ceremonial occasion, but he would express his concern about the war by reading from Hiroshima, the implication, of course, being that a war like this can escalate into the point where it's nuclear war. And this outraged the president, and there is this long scene of conversation between Mrs. Johnson, who was acting for the president in this respect, and myself, in which she was telling me that the president and she simply did not want John Hersey to read Hiroshima in the White House. Well, as I say, it's a long business between Mrs. Johnson and me, but the nub of it was that I was against what Mrs. Johnson was proposing on 2 grounds. One was on the grounds that it amounted to censorship, and I did not want the first House of the United States involved in censorship. And the second was a purely practical point for the protection of the president. If I had called Hersey and done what was wanted of me, namely said, why don't you read from one of your novels and not read from Hiroshima, this certainly would have gotten out. Hersey would have certainly withdrawn, as I would have under the circumstances, and the whole world would be sitting there. A little incident of this sort would turn into one in which the whole world said the President of the United States is a man who does not believe in any kind of freedom.
Well, of course, this was quite a luncheon that you didn't eat.
Yeah.
You touched a little tomato there. This luncheon with you and Mrs. Johnson and Bess Abel.
Her name is pronounced Abel, yes.
Abel.
Bess Abel, the
And-
social secretary. Yeah.
And another secretary who were not too well acquainted with too many of the works, but nonetheless saying it's impossible gall. If we just read it, Mrs. Keene said, the next thing he'll be telling the president what to eat. And throughout there's a refrain of Lady Bird Johnson.
Yeah, and the
president
she keeps,
does.
yeah.
How's that go again?
The president, Mrs. Johnson, kept saying, "The president and I do not want this man to come here and read this." It was a kind of litany on Mrs. Johnson, who was in an extremely difficult position. Mrs. Johnson is a very remarkable woman, absolutely devoted to the welfare of her husband, but a woman who, I'm not going to try to read thoughts into her mind, who, in my opinion, would not have acted this way on this occasion had she not been so devoted to her husband.
Well, that's precisely the point. You paint a very interesting picture here, and it was her devotion to her husband, no matter what.
No matter what.
But the fact is, what happened to be president of the United States.
That's right.
And so, therefore, his policies may determine the destinies of billions of people. But it doesn't matter. Her husband, no matter what.
That's
And
Mrs.
therefore-
Johnson. Yeah.
Yes, and therefore that creates a rather interesting situation.
Well, yeah, in view, this is a fascinating woman. Somebody ought to. There's a really American story there from a fascinating background. Her father, T.J. Taylor, was a dirt farmer down in Alabama, a tenant farmer, and falls in love with the daughter of the man who owns the country around there. And the woman, the mother, runs off with the father. They go to Texas. And he becomes the big man around. He owns everything around that part of Texas, and she becomes what I've called in the book a kind of an American original. The mother does. Beautiful woman, graceful, cultivated, conducting in this little hole in Texas. She was a suffragette, which nobody could understand. She was pro-Negro. It was one of the worst anti-Negro districts, but she'd keep inviting Negroes into the home. The house was full of books. And full of good records, Caruso records, for example. And once a year, alone and majestic, this woman would repair up here to Chicago, to the opera season. Well, this is two very remarkable people, strong people, in Mrs. Johnson's background. And she, when she went to the University of Texas, was a kind of an avant-gardist, if you can talk that. I mean, she asked her date to take her to Chekhov instead of a movie. She sipped bootleg cherry wine.
She might have been a Metro American.
Yeah, she was. That's right. So this is but this man.
There was a drive.
The what?
Both had a drive.
Drive, yeah.
To make it.
Yeah, to make it. And she met this man, and she was in love with this man, and she stayed in love with him. And her definition of love was not to remake him, but to fulfill him. Whether he was a young pup of a congressman and she was borrowing money to help him get ahead, or sitting there and defending him in a position where he was, I think it's safe to say, simply wrong. I don't want to be arrogant and try to say I was right and he was wrong, but I think on this issue he simply was wrong.
Well, fulfilling his life meant to him only one thing, considering his conditioning and all, to make it.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened that he made it as president in the last third of the 20th century, and thus trauma and danger and peril for the world, as well as, strangely enough, within adversity, these strangely comical aspects that you bring out. But always come back to you and this book. Now, I must point out that Professor Goldman took a very courageous stand here. Your position obviously getting more and more untenable, you felt.
Yeah, except that I felt, I want to say this in fairness to the President and Mrs. Johnson, they put up with an awful lot from me, so to speak. That is, I continually did and said things which I knew the President did not fit the President's ideas of things, but he put up with them. Now, what his reasons were, I don't know.
I meant untenable, perhaps from your own point of view.
But from my own point of view, I was beginning to wonder how much good I could do around there, because there was a kind of fundamental clash between the way he went at things and the way I thought they ought to be gone at.
So
he might have been right, but the point is that I didn't think so anyhow.
Well, it came to many matters, and perhaps we can't, your book discusses them. a certain check, too, involved the question of a little touch of McCarthyism here. That is Joe rather than Gene McCarthyism
That's
here.
right.
In that he had checks on different scholars, FBI checks and various checks made.
Yeah, well, the president, this is another striking thing about Lyndon Johnson. In the earlier period, he was a tremendous civil libertarian in a quiet way. I'm not sure where it came from. It came in part from, again, his father's tradition. His father was part of a political machine down there that had fought the Ku Klux Klan furiously, and he was very strong about restrictions on civil liberties. The president was, and did a number of quiet things around Washington as president to protect him. One of his closest friends and intimates was George Reedy, who here at the University of Chicago, back in the Hutchins days, was the head of the Young Socialist League, and a left-wing Socialist League, and remained a strong libertarian. But then, as always the war came on, and the president began to see himself beleaguered by all these people, these radicals.
Almost a fantasy aspect.
It's almost a fantasy. And that one scene I described there was one that I shall never forget, of the president saying, now these men in the Senate who are opposing me, I know where they're getting their stuff from. It's all coming from the Russian embassy. I sat there really appalled, and finally I spoke up and said, Mr. President, you know that simply isn't true. You just know it's not true. And as I remark in the book, he had a look on his face, and I don't know what the look means. He went on a little bit, then he stopped it. But he did. He got into this mood about the war, and
You think he began to suspect you?
not of being a communist, but of being impossible. Yeah.
I think you mentioned his early civil libertarian background. He was helped, in the very early days, by a great civil libertarian, Aubrey Williams, who was later attacked by Joe McCarthy. That is, Johnson was helped as a young National Youth Administrator by the head of it then, Aubrey Williams. And so he himself was helped on his way up by civil libertarians, which is a factor.
He always spoke very highly of
He was helped by them, which I think lends a note of irony to the whole. Just to say, Reedy was there, so you mentioned the group that's around, and your descriptions, by the way, of the White House attaches, the aides, is a very fascinating one.
Thank you.
Marvin Watson. How would you describe Watson?
Watson from, here again, another quite intelligent, very decent sort of fella. He came from a little town down there, and there's nothing wrong with coming from a little town or coming from down there. The point is that nothing happened to these men to expand their vistas. We all came from very limited things, but then something happened to us along the way. And he ended up working for the Lone Star Steel Company, which had a tremendously reactionary record down there. And Marvin Watson's view of America was the most constrained one I had heard since the 1930s. I cite in here that he was the man the president had going over the FBI checks on people, and he actually suspected Newball Morris. Yeah. I don't know whether that means anything to a Midwestern.
No, but you might describe this is a great comic.
Yeah, well, for one group of people, he raised the FBI question about Newball Morris. And Newball Morris was a New York Republican aristocrat of a vague kind of liberalism.
The kind of chairman of a bank, was he not?
Oh, chairman of banks, a U.S. Steel director, a friend of Charles de Gaulle, this sort of thing.
But he suspected me subversive because he was interested in the arts, wasn't that it?
He also had, it was one of these typical cases. He was a member of an organization which later had some communists in it.
I thought also because connected with the New York...
the arts helped.
Yeah. And but also, to me, two of the most fascinating studies are two who might be described as Metro-Americans of the staff, and of course Moyer and Goodwin.
Yeah.
And I hear, obviously, your book makes it clear, so it's no tale out of school. Obviously, as you see them, two young men on the make.
Very much so. In very different ways.
Yeah.
Both very bright young men. Goodwin coming from the New England Harvard type of background, who is a curious amalgam of a lot of things, and ends up a fellow whose delight, so far as I can understand, Goodman, is really in power and manipulation for its own sake. I think that explains why later he kept jumping around from McCarthy to Kennedy and so forth. He was looking for the power.
The main chance.
The main chance. Moyers is a different type, comes from a religious background. As a matter of fact, was trained by the seminary, but that's peculiar kind of Southern religion. I mentioned in there that his enemies called him Elmer Gantry. Now, it's unfair, it's caricature, but it strikes at this, what some small Southern towns have in it, the young man who is both pious and furiously on the make, and who's able to rationalize doing a lot of other things that perhaps some of the rest of us would have difficulty rationalizing.
Now, as I'm thinking out loud, as you're talking now, something just occurred to me. I think a point that could be very dramatic, certainly for a play or a novel. That Moyer, in a sense, his psyche, I hate to be honest, is very close to Johnson's. That is, there's a righteous, small town, very 100% American air, religious, at the same time being on the make.
On the make.
And so
we're on the make
Johnson.
in a peculiar way, if I may say so. We're all on the make in one sense. That is, we want the status and recognition and a sense of achievement and so forth. But I think you're using the term in the sense that the drive to make it, in their case, is overwhelming and sweeps aside the ordinary considerations that restrain the rest of us. Is that the way you mean it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, that's true.
To make out certain values involved, make it, and even though the means may be a little on the untoward side, to make it.
Yeah. In Johnson's case, I quite agree with your comparison. And, of course, as I point out here, in fact, the great source of Moyers' power in the White House was the fact that the president never had a son. And down where the president comes from, and perhaps even in Chicago, a lot of men who haven't had sons feel that somehow or another they aren't fulfilled. I've noticed that among a lot of my friends, and he was almost embarrassed by the fact that there was a wife and two daughters. A he-man wants to.
The machismo was, in a sense, was a reflection on what he valued so much, machismo.
That's right.
The he-man aspect,
That's
was
right.
John Wayne aspect.
That's right.
Here. So we have this.
He tried to find a son in Bobby Baker, and Bobby Baker did him in. Then Moyers came along, who's a totally different type, and
so we come to something he said earlier, not understanding these young, not understanding that the very values that he considered sacred, making it were those that many of the protesting young no longer considered, not only important, they considered immoral. And so thus there was no connection between him and the young dissidents.
There certainly was not, no. In fairness to him, and I say point blank in this book, I want this to be a fair book, and I hope it is. There is a side of Lyndon Johnson that has nothing to do with making it. And that is a profound and deeply felt sense of community with ordinary people in the United States, their aims, their hopes, their problems, their needs, their desires, their aspirations. And that's why I call this book The Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson. It doesn't mean, oh, how awful. It means, oh, what could have been with a man of his abilities, a man of this deep feeling for the people of the United States, a man with his drive to do things, that it all turned out so badly. And it was this side of him that made him so effective as the advocate of Medicare and aid to education. Education, well, it got so around there that people like me became very reluctant what we suggested to the president that he do in the educational field because he accepted them too quickly.
I think
the rest of the things you didn't have to worry about. You were going to have to fight through. But though he deeply is convinced that this great nation is going to achieve its ultimate greatness through education.
See, I don't think there's any danger of a reader of this book being in any extent thinking that you were unfair to the president. On the contrary, the very title itself, with which some may disagree, and I, for one, may think not, because tragedy means, to me, this is my own feeling, fall from a great height, and to me there was not. However, this is my.
No.
But so you are I'm saying that you're very fair indeed to Lyndon B. Johnson on the book, from my point of view, and I doubt whether anyone, because you do point out certain aspects. That also was something that was a part of a continuity here, too. Much action was happening on the streets. That impelled a president, whether it be Jack Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson, to do certain acts.
Right.
Not because he was an altruistic figure, but because the very necessity of circumstance, too, was a factor in this. But if I could return to this book of Eric Goldman's, it's a very, very fascinating chapter in American history. Now we come back to you again. When did everything for you finally say you had to pack up? Because it was your own decision.
I was developing slowly and gradually a feeling that the time was coming to leave. Of course, one always should leave there, even if one is radiantly in attunement with the administration, because those jobs burn you out and you run out. But I meant in terms of a more specific thing. It was when the blow-up came between the president and me on the White House Festival of the Arts that I knew definitely I should leave. And this was based on a couple of things. One of them is the president was so angry at me that I knew my effect, even though the anger would go away. And he did a lot to indicate that he wanted to make peace. Nevertheless, your effectiveness is hurt. Also, I was becoming skeptical about this whole role of intellectual in residence. You notice, I recommend that it be abolished. I don't think that's the way to. I think we ought to try to get around the president, men in normal staff positions who have the better qualities of intellectuals and not set up one character and say, he's the intellectual. There were massive things, and as it happened, I actually went on working 14 more months there because there were a lot of projects I wanted to get done, this, that, and the other thing. But I was leaving from that moment.
Doesn't this always lead to something else? And why I think your book is a significant one. This very fact, to talk about you, Eric Goldman, or predecessors and other presidents, not to compare you in any way with the different circumstances with Schlesinger, but that someone who is a creative spirit, historian, or whatever he might be, also a danger of being, overused word today, co-opted too, without realizing it. I don't mean kept, that's somewhat used, but co-opt without realizing it. Therefore, you're saying he has to be an outside.
Yeah, you see, many of my dear friends in the intellectual field are quite properly concerned with the better qualities of the intellectual life shall be brought to bear on the American government, a position with which I entirely agree. But as I say, I think they're best brought to bear by the intellectuals performing his role of staying outside the government and saying things and criticizing it, and of getting into the White House men who are essentially part of the political operation, but have the better qualities of intellect. For example, Johnson had some men around like that. George Reedy, for example, was a man who had every quality of the good intellectual, including the bookishness. And he was the best read man around there. So I think sometimes we intellectuals try to do these things too easily. There's get a man in there.
At a certain time, a different time, and a man Johnson admired, when it was on the way up was, of course, FDR.
Yeah.
Now, in FDR's case, there was an emergency. There was a depression.
Yeah.
Certain moment, and he called upon men like Tugwell and others, his own brains trust.
But he put them in office, you see.
Yes. Now we come to something, a wholly different approach, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, you see this idea, though, that somehow there is to be a liaison between intellectuals and the White House. That doesn't work. If you want Joe Smith at the University of so-and-so to work on the poverty program, the way to get Joe Smith effectively to do it, in my opinion, is either A, appoint him to an office.
In short, Harry Hopkins and Rex Tugwell made policy.
That's right.
And
they're in the midst of it. That's right.
And Johnson did not allow the scholars to make policy. It's his.
Right.
They're merely advisors or whatever.
That's right. Or the other way Joe Smith can do it is stay outside, write the study, write the book that the men working there will read and effectuate in part. Now, for example, people have often asked me, well, how could a president be any good on domestic policy when he never read books? The president didn't read. President Johnson, I hope the audience will pardon me, I'm used to calling him the president and skip the fact that we have a different one. No, he didn't read books. That's not the way his habit, not his method. But he was interested in what was in books if it had something to say pertinent to getting something done. And so in that case, of course, you should have men around who read the books and give him the thing in a memo form. We're not going to have bookish presidents, except in rare instances. The qualities that make for bookishness are not the ones that make for winning elections for the most
No,
part.
we're not so much about that, though. In other countries, men who are the president of Senegal, let's say, is a poet, But that's not the point. We're talking now about respect for this elector so that he can mold policy as Roosevelt did. I'm talking now about something that might make...
That's right. I went off your point. You're correct, yeah.
In short, Harry Hopkins, whether it be or FERA or WPA, or whether it be Tugwell, or whether it be Gardner Means, whoever it was, see, they were men who told him, and he accepted or did, but they were in charge of groups. And here the guys were not in charge of groups. You were not really in charge, were you, really?
I was in charge of the group, but the president set it up in such a way that it was not going to... You see, I think there's, talking to your point now, I think we've skipped one other difficulty in the situation, namely that I agree with your word, respect for the intellectual, if you will permit me to define it, to include an understanding of what the intellectual process is. Mr. Johnson did not understand that, not because he didn't have high intelligence of his own, which he did, but because he had never met it in his life, didn't have any contact with it. And his idea of an intellectual or of an idea was simply the end product of the intellectual process. That is, it was, what do I do tomorrow? What legislation do I propose? What do I say? And so forth. Now, a man like FDR had an interest in and a feeling for the whole road by which you arrived there. And I think that's the fundamental difference between them.
Isn't there something else? This perhaps we've come toward the end of what to me is a very entrancing, in a very good sense, conversation with Eric Goldman, because it's revealing about a certain time we live in, intellectuals, whatever they may be called, scholars, creative spirits, and political figures, a political figure in this instance, and his colleagues, associates. Roosevelt was also a manipulator. So was Johnson. But isn't one big difference, would you agree to this? I'm just thinking out loud now.
Yeah.
Sense of history. Johnson lacked, I think. Roosevelt understood something, an overwhelming event happening, and therefore something radical must be done. Something wholly unconventional, untried must be done. And that...
He understood how the crisis of today fitted into a series of crises of the past and how the past illuminated. The president, again, if I may just stress this point for those in our audience who may be interested, the president quickly reacted to history, but it was ad hoc history. I learned that the fastest way to persuade the president to do something was to give him a historical analogy, where some other president, faced with so-and-so, did so-and-so. But to him, you see, again, it was an idea of what to do, and it was history buttressing. He did not respond to history as a kind of cumulative human experience from which you drew not a specific action, but what you were talking about, an approach, a sense
of history, perhaps. Yeah. And thus we come to also a learning process for a scholar, a distinguished scholar, Eric Goldman, and for a certain experience for Lyndon Johnson. And the book is The Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, Eric Goldman, Alfred Knopp of the publishers. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking with you.